But of course, since we have spoken last, UCLA and USC now in the Big Ten. There's a story right there that we could just stop and talk about. You've got coast to coast potential of games. I've seen a lot of people complain about, I don't hate it. I'm not going to be wanting to watch 11. I don't think they're not going to put USC or UCLA in Indiana on at 11 o'clock, people. They want you to watch it, and they know you're not going to watch that game. So if there's an 11 o'clock Big Ten game, I'm going to guess it's one that people probably don't really care about. But that is gigantic having USC and UCLA now a part of the Big Ten, as well as a little crazy and kind of hard to get your mind around.
It is in the sense that it's geographically baffling, I should say, to folks that are used to regional alliances that form conferences and then the rivalries that develop from there. But as we've seen over probably the last 2 decades now, ever since probably the Big East got picked apart and left for dead, at least the version I always knew growing up, a little relieved to see the Big Ten on the front foot when it comes to the conference realignment issues after the SEC poached Texas and Oklahoma. You knew this day was coming, and quite frankly, this day's not done. I think we're likely waiting to see what direction Notre Dame decides to go before the commissioners kind of where the dust settles and what's left and who's left for the picking. But that's very much where we are right now. I think we are, quite frankly, on the precipice of the collapse of the modern conference system as we know it, as evidenced by these moves, where you can make the argument Oklahoma and Texas are geographically at least proximic to the SEC. This kind of breaks that mold. And it's not that big of a stretch from what we saw, I suppose, with Rutgers. An area that was never really considered to be Big Ten country. Now, guess what? Because of the televisions they bring to the table and the increased media dollars those televisions are going to generate, you got to throw that conventional wisdom of geography out the window and look at it more as a matter of population density. Because quite frankly, that's all ESPN and Fox Sports care about is how many televisions can they get their content in front of and get people to tune into. And make no mistake, that's what's driving the bus here. And, ultimately, we're probably going to see a scenario where there's, if not one super conference, very much two, the SEC and the Big Ten, one controlled by Fox, one controlled by ESPN. And they're going to do everything they can to gobble up every media market that makes sense for their business. And my guess is Notre Dame's the next big shoe to drop. And then once you see that move, a lot of things are going to settle themselves out in relatively short order, because while most of the world was completely unaware of this was happening, there was already applications and approvals signed and ready to go for the press release last week when this first kind of bomb dropped on us. So don't be surprised if there's more bombs coming, with the biggest one being the Irish.
Yeah, that has been the pretty much the topic of conversation, that they are the next and the biggest, ripest plum apple on the tree that is standing, that is shining. And as you said, I agree. It's going to be the Big Ten and the SEC when it comes to football. So I don't see Notre Dame in the SEC. I don't think that they want to be in the SEC. They're more of a proud of an academic. They're academics. They also already lend themselves scheduling wise to the Big Ten with people like Michigan and Michigan State, USC that is already on their schedule. Proximity wise, which that doesn't matter, but of course that makes total sense. They don't need to be in a TV market because they are a draw. And collectively, and I talked about this with Mike DeCourcy earlier, right now, Big Ten teams are looking at probably their haul coming in at around 100 million, up from 50 million. But if you add Notre Dame to that mix, not just because it's Notre Dame, but now you add Notre Dame to USC, to UCLA, to Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State, these names, that could potentially not just raise it a little bit, but substantially raise that number, I think, to a potentially 150 million to a program, which is mind-boggling. But it's very possible. But then What do we do? How's the college football championship going to be run? Let's say Notre Dame is in the Big Ten. It's the Big Ten and the SEC. What do teams that are in the Pac-12 and the Big 12 do? What does Oklahoma State do? What they're not going to be. It's going to be like soccer. I keep saying this, like the championship in the Premier League.
Yeah, it's fascinating times in that regard, because all these schools that are now being adversely affected by these moves, particularly those in the Pac-10, the Big 12, the ACC for that matter, all the presidents and all the athletic directors and the commissioners that were resistant to an updated, mollified college football playoff schedule, now they're left holding the bag because they're going to be on the outside looking in.
Kevin.
Yeah, I agree with that with that statement. So
short and sweet. So what's next for the Big Ten, or do you think, Chronic? We're all wondering what happens with Notre Dame, because that's the next chip. That's the next chip to fall. They have to go somewhere. I just don't think, with all the different scheduling that's going to have to take place with ESPN and with Fox or NBC or CBS or whomever it ends up being, that then trying for Notre Dame to schedule as an independent on top of that, is this going to be not only more difficult, but it's going to cost Notre Dame money. If they're not in, say, the Big Ten, that's going to cost them 2/3 of what they could make. I think they're making like $33 million now. They're going to be making well over $100 million in the Big Ten. I don't see how they can turn that down.
Well, and that, previously Notre Dame always felt like they were untouchable because, they were the first college program to have a national contract effectively with NBC. They had a nationwide brand. They were, as an independent, they didn't have that alliance. And they were left basically to star as the biggest, or shine as the biggest star on the stage with that NBC contract and the national exposure it gave their brand. Well, now the Big Ten has positioned itself to be the first national conference, with media markets spanning from LA to Chicago, Detroit, the greater New York area and beyond. Now the Big Ten, now a conference for the first time ever, has something Notre Dame doesn't, as far as terms of the dollars involved, because while they were the first to have that contract, it pales in comparison to the numbers that the Big Ten's now able to offer, and likely the SEC will down the pipeline. But Notre Dame's always been able to skirt that simply because they were Indy, they were the Irish, they had the NBC contract, but they also had a team that could compete as an independent. And the committee has long given them a little bit more deference, perhaps, than the average independent when it comes to the college football playoff. Well, as we mentioned earlier, with all these massive powers now aligned in two conferences, Notre Dame finds themselves perhaps on the outside looking in. So just to retain that seat at the big boys table, they're likely going to have to make a move. Just from a hubris standpoint, if they want to give themselves the best shot at the college football playoff and the championship that follows that. Now, whether that's the Big Ten or the SEC remains to be seen. But the expectation is they're going to have to pick a side at some point or another, and it would seem, at least on its face, the Big Ten probably aligns a little more closely with Notre Dame's academic mission, with some of their values and ethos that Lord knows they love to profess since the beginning of time. For those who grew up next to some Irish fans, so it's going to be fascinating to see. But that's probably the next shoe to drop that sets in motion a series of events where I don't know if it completely gobbles up the other conferences, but it certainly shifts the tide, quite frankly, past the point of no return, if we're not already there, as far as the death of conferences as we know it. So it's fascinating. It's kind of terrifying. It's kind of sad for college football fans who have long enjoyed those regional rivalries and affiliations. But in this day and age of media dollars, that's driving everything right now. And it's a little jarring for Indiana fans that I talk to, that are more basketball centric, you got to recognize basketball is simply a trailer on this whole thing. It's being pulled by the bus that's college football. That's going to drive everything, and basketball is just going to follow wherever football takes it. So there's going to be some really, really interesting realignments here, my guess, by the end of the summer. And we'll see if and when it stops, because there's still a couple years away, which is honestly quite short when it comes to these types of timetables, before you see USC and UCLA start competing in the Big Ten. 2 full calendar years, academic years left. But my guess is those aren't the only additions that we'll see by the time the competition starts up in 2024.
Yeah, Kevin, and that's the thing we're talking about is who might that be? Because I'll be honest with you, the UCLA USC thing just caught me off guard. It was like, wow, but mainly because of proximity. But when you're talking about the money that they're going to be making now, being a part of the Big Ten, the travel part doesn't matter. Now, what I do expect to see, Kevin, is a lot more group sporting events in the Big Ten, especially for the smaller non-revenue sports, bigger tennis events, bigger lacrosse events, maybe volleyball, etc. But it just the Big Ten net or the Big Ten brand. It grew a lot now that you had USC and UCLA to that.
Yeah, and I think too that you talk about is Rutgers going to fly to UCLA for a baseball game on a Tuesday night? I think that's the question, or a softball game, or a women's basketball game. And if you have that group, which is why I think that you will see everyone's talking about Notre Dame, but I do think that expansion west, because you've got Cal and Stanford, you've got the San Francisco market, you've got Oregon and Washington, you've got the Portland and the Seattle markets there that you could tap into if you take a pairing out there, and then you can group it, and that would essentially annihilate the Pac-12. I mean, if you made that move out there, even before Notre Dame, to be able to do that and to be able to create that group play that you were talking about, Jim, in terms of the ability to kind of pod up for the non-revenue sports and so forth. So I think the next expansion will be continuing to raid the Pac-12.
Well, and we'll see how that goes, because and now what happens, Chronic? What happens to the Big 12 and the Pac-12? You talk about this historical. We can think about the Big 8 back in the days when it was SMU and all of that. But and so there's always change. It's just this change is so massive. But what happens to those conferences now? The Pac-12 and the Big 12 are there's virtually nothing they can do to keep up with the Big Ten and the SEC now. It is the Big Ten and the SEC.
Yeah, if you want to know what happens, ask the Big East, ask the Horizon League, ask the AAC. There's all these conferences that have shown us what happens. Once their crown jewels get raided, they basically become second-class citizens in college, Division I college athletics.
Southwest Conference,
at least in terms of how football is driving revenue and alliances right now. And there's a lot of folks they're kind of scratching their head trying to see what the future holds for their teams that get stuck on the outside looking in. And there's a lot of crowing from some of those fans that find themselves on the inside looking out at all those that have been excluded. And my only caution is, be careful, be real careful right now, because with football driving so much of this, unless you have a program that can drive massive amounts of eyeballs consistently and reliably, your program's at risk of getting left behind. I wouldn't be surprised if there's not when this is all said and done, a super league of football teams, and then a lower division that's basically operates kind of like D2 does right now, or the 2 different levels of football programs right now in the championship series. And it's kind of maddening to think, but Indiana could very well find themselves in that position here in the next 5 to 10 years, where they're getting booted from the Big Ten because they don't compete at a high enough level to maintain whatever the brand's football reputation is. So we'll see how that all works out. For the time being now, consider Indiana one of the haves versus the have-nots. If they're wise, they're going to pour a boatload of resources into bolstering the football program from a staffing standpoint, from a facility standpoint, and really doing everything in their power to bolster the brand, because when the day comes, and it will come for all schools, they're going to be weighed and measured and determine who's worthy of staying with the big boys and sitting at the big table. And fortunately, IU's last 100+ years of affiliation with the Big Ten has afforded them the position where they're going to be cashing some massive checks here, just absolutely astronomical checks, which should hopefully level some of the playing field as they try to continue to elevate the program's brand and competitiveness. But they're going to have to act with urgency because the day is coming, probably sooner than later, where some of these commissioners are going to be looking and weighing programs against programs and seeing what makes sense for their Super League. And you best hope that you find yourself among the haves when that's all said and done, because quite frankly, this is starting to approach now professional numbers as far as the revenues that are going to be generated. And if you're not included in that, best of luck to you, because it's going to be, you're going to be bringing a gun to a nuclear missile fight at that point. And it's not a fair fight.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Don't you think, though, Chronic, that schools like, Indiana, schools like Kansas, the traditional blue blood basketball schools, do provide some brand value in that? And also on the other side, especially if we're going to be paring down non-conference teams, provide some of those big boys a little cushion, shall we say, an easy win on the football side. Right. And maybe that's how Indiana survives, so to speak, while, trying to get better. You know what I mean? I don't want to denigrate Indiana because, look, Tom Allen a couple of years ago had it going, and then the bottom fell out, and they're 2-10 now, and they're trying to come back from that, but let's face it, Indiana as a football program historically has been, one of the have-nots, you know what I mean? But maybe the Big Ten sees value in that, just as the SEC sees value in Vanderbilt.
Yes and no. These guys are obviously filling a year-long television, or at least 2/3 long television schedules. Basketball season is a big portion of that, but the eyeballs basketball draws pales in comparison to football. And again, look at the Big East and how they just got left behind simply because they were so basketball centric. But the football was what was really driving the numbers and pushing the change. So I think Indiana does, when you look at the IUs, the Purdues, the Northwesterns, the Iowas of the world. Maybe Iowa's not a fair comparison because they competed at a pretty high level in football. Maybe Nebraska for that matter. It certainly helps to have a basketball program that drives record-setting numbers year in, year out as far as viewership. But that's going to be an afterthought rather than a primary consideration when it comes to how these guys pick what teams are going to be part of their groups. But it certainly is nice to have, if things were a tie, you're going to tilt towards the program that can deliver eyeballs year round.
Absolutely, and I think that we're heading in that direction. I had something else that I wanted to ask in regards to that, but from a scheduling standpoint, how big is it going to be, though, to have regular season basketball games where Indiana is going to Pauley Pavilion and vice versa?
Well, one thing that I think gets lost in this discussion is with that type of cheese that they're talking about, charter planes are going to be the standard rather than the exception for all programs.
Absolutely.
And, when you're flying direct from your local airport, these guys, they never have to walk through terminals. They just step right on the plane. They get off the bus. They land. They're on their charter bus heading to their hotel. It's certainly going to be kind of a mind trip when you think about playing in Pauley as a conference game, when you think about playing in the Rose Bowl as a conference game. But, I thought the same thing when we started playing in Maryland and Piscataway, and when we've got the Big Ten basketball tournament in DC and in New York. that's the way of the world, and it's kind of wild because I still know folks that are honked off about Penn State being added to the Big Ten. I mean, not to mention the additions that followed after that. So I think for some, this will probably be something that they're never willing to accept. But I think as you see the continuing changes in the college landscape, this is just what we're going to have to get used to. These schedules are going to look more akin to an NBA schedule, perhaps, than what we've ever known before. Maybe IU's got an advantage after their last experience going from Dayton to Portland, but get used to some of those wild turnarounds and time zone shifts because those are going to be the standard now, likely going forward.